A young woman faces a stressful routine, aggravated by endless sleepless nights caused by her neighbor's constant dog barking. Exhaustion and anxiety push her to the limit, leading her to consider an extreme solution. Determined to silence the barking forever, she plots her plan. However, when she arrived at the location, what she saw made her legs tremble in a way she could never have imagined. The bustling streets of New York City pulsed with energy as the first rays of sunlight peeked through the towering skyscrapers. In a modest apartment building nestled in the heart of Brooklyn, Sarah Thompson, a young professional in her early 30s, stirred restlessly in her bed. The gentle glow of dawn filtered through her curtains, casting a soft light on her tired face. Her small, cozy bedroom was a testament to her organized nature. A meticulously arranged bookshelf, a neat desk with a laptop closed shut, and a few potted plants adding a touch of life to the space. However, the tranquil scene was shattered by a cacophony of barks emanating from the apartment next door. Sarah's eyes, rimmed with dark circles, snapped open, and she let out a frustrated groan. The relentless noise had become an unwelcome alarm clock, robbing her of precious sleep night after night. Outside her window, the city was already coming to life. Yellow taxis honked their horns, early commuters hurried along the sidewalks, and the aroma of fresh bagels wafted up from the deli on the corner. But for Sarah, this vibrant city symphony was drowned out by the incessant barking that had plagued her for months. Her apartment, once a sanctuary from the demands of her high-pressure job at a prestigious marketing firm in Manhattan, had become a prison of sleepless nights and mounting anxiety. The walls seemed to close in around her, amplifying the sounds of her neighbor's neglected dogs and her own racing thoughts. Sarah Thompson was the epitome of a driven New York professional. At 32, she had already climbed the corporate ladder to become a senior account manager at a top-tier marketing firm. Her colleagues admired her sharp mind and creative flair, but lately they had noticed a change. The once vibrant and enthusiastic Sarah now seemed perpetually exhausted, her usually impeccable appearance slightly disheveled and her quick wit dulled by fatigue. Every morning, Sarah would drag herself out of bed, her eyes bloodshot from another night of interrupted sleep. She'd stare at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the woman looking back at her. Her long chestnut hair, usually styled to perfection, now hung limply around her pale face. As she applied concealer to hide the dark circles under her eyes, Sarah couldn't help but feel a twinge of resentment towards her neighbor, Mr. Johnson, and his noisy dogs. Mr. Johnson, a gruff man in his 60s, lived next door with his two dogs, Max and Bella. He was a reclusive figure, rarely seen by the other tenants in the building. When Sarah had first moved in, she had tried to strike up a conversation with him, but his curt responses and unwelcoming demeanor had quickly put an end to her neighborly attempts. The only consistent signs of his presence were the sounds of his dogs barking at all hours of the day and night. Max and Bella, Mr. Johnson's dogs, were a mystery to Sarah. She had caught glimpses of them through the building's windows, a large German shepherd and a smaller mixed breed. Their barks echoed through the thin walls of the apartment building, a constant reminder of their presence. Sometimes Sarah thought she could hear whimpers mixed in with the barking, but she couldn't be sure. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah's life began to unravel. Her work performance, once stellar, began to slip. She found herself making careless mistakes in important presentations and struggling to keep up with client demands. Her boss, once her biggest champion, had started giving her concerned looks and gentle warnings about her declining performance. At night, Sarah would lie awake, her mind racing with anxiety. The constant barking seemed to amplify her fears. Fear of losing her job, fear of never getting a good night's sleep again, fear of what her life was becoming. She had tried everything: earplugs, white noise machines, even sleeping pills, but nothing seemed to block out the relentless noise from next door. As her mental health deteriorated, Sarah found herself withdrawing from her friends and family. She stopped attending her weekly yoga classes, cancelled plans with friends, and rarely called her parents back in her hometown of Boston. The vibrant social life she once enjoyed in the city that never sleeps had dwindled to lonely nights in her apartment, accompanied only by the sound of barking dogs and her own tumultuous thoughts. On a gloomy Tuesday morning, Sarah reached her breaking point. After another sleepless night filled with incessant barking, she stood in her kitchen, clutching a cup of coffee with trembling hands. Her reflection in the window showed a woman on the edge, disheveled, exhausted, and desperate. In that moment, a dark thought crept into her mind. She remembered the rat poison she had bought months ago when she thought she had heard rodents in the walls. The small box sat untouched under her sink. With a mix of desperation and shame, Sarah found herself considering the unthinkable, using the poison to silence the dogs forever. Her hands shook as she reached for the box, her mind clouded by exhaustion and despair. She knew it was wrong, knew it went against everything she believed in, but the prospect of peace seemed to overpower her moral compass. With the poison in her bag, Sarah left her apartment, her heart racing with a toxic mixture of determination and guilt. As she approached Mr. Johnson's door, the sound of weak, pitiful whimpers reached her ears, different from the usual barking. Something wasn't right. Taking a deep breath, Sarah knocked on the door. The sound echoed in the hallway, but there was no response from inside, save for a slight increase in the dog's whimpering. After a moment's hesitation, she tried the handle and found it unlocked. The door creaked open, revealing a scene that would forever change the course of her life. The apartment was dark and musty, with an overwhelming smell of neglect. As Sarah's eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw Max and Bella huddled in a corner. The once robust German Shepherd and the smaller mixed breed were now mere shadows of dogs, their ribs visible through matted fur, eyes dulled with hunger and thirst. Sarah's heart clenched with a mixture of shock, pity, and shame. The poison in her bag suddenly felt like a lead weight, a stark reminder of how close she had come to committing an unforgivable act. She rushed to the kitchen, filled a bowl with water, and brought it to the dogs. They lapped at it eagerly, their tails wagging weakly in gratitude. As she watched the dogs drink, Sarah's mind raced. Where was Mr. Johnson? How long had these poor animals been left alone? The apartment showed signs of long abandonment, unopened mail piled by the door, a thin layer of dust covering every surface, and an empty refrigerator when she checked for any food for the dogs. The gravity of the situation dawned on Sarah. These weren't the nuisance she had perceived them to be. They were victims of neglect, abandoned and suffering. In that moment, all her resentment towards the dogs evaporated, replaced by a fierce determination to help them. As Sarah tended to Max and Bella, she felt a profound shift in her emotions. The exhaustion and frustration that had clouded her judgment began to lift, replaced by a surge of compassion and purpose. She scoured Mr. Johnson's kitchen for anything edible, finally finding a half-empty bag of dog food tucked away in a cupboard. The dogs ate ravenously, their tails wagging with renewed energy. While the dogs ate, Sarah's mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened. She recalled the last time she had seen Mr. Johnson. It must have been weeks ago. Had he simply abandoned these poor creatures? The thought filled her with a mixture of anger and disbelief. As she stroked Max's matted fur, Sarah's phone buzzed. It was a message from her boss asking why she wasn't at the important client meeting that had started 30 minutes ago. For a moment, Sarah froze, her old life colliding with this new, unexpected situation. But as she looked at the grateful eyes of Max and Bella, she made a decision. She quickly typed out a message explaining a family emergency and promised to make it up to the team. With that done, Sarah turned her full attention back to the dogs. She knew she couldn't leave them in this state. The Sarah from yesterday might have called animal control and washed her hands of the situation, but this new Sarah, awakened by the dog's plight, knew she had to do more. She began to clean the apartment, opening windows to let in fresh air, filling water bowls, and creating comfortable beds from old blankets she found in a closet. As she worked, she talked softly to Max and Bella, promising them that things would get better. The dogs seemed to understand, following her from room to room, their tails wagging with increasing strength. As the day progressed, Sarah found herself facing a series of unexpected challenges. The first hurdle came when she realized the extent of Max and Bella's health issues. Upon closer inspection, she noticed that both dogs had patches of missing fur, possibly due to malnutrition or skin conditions. Bella limped slightly, favoring her left hind leg, while Max's breathing seemed labored and wheezy. Sarah knew they needed veterinary care, but she hesitated. How could she take someone else's dogs to the vet? What if Mr. Johnson suddenly returned? And more pressingly, how would she afford the potentially expensive medical bills? While pondering these questions, Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time it was her boss calling. With a deep breath, she answered, bracing herself for the reprimand she knew was coming. Her boss was understandably upset about her missed meeting and demanded an explanation. Sarah, torn between her professional obligations and her newfound responsibility to the dogs, stumbled through a vague explanation about a family emergency. "I need you back in the office immediately, Sarah," her boss said sternly. "We have damage control to do with the client. This isn't like you at all." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Sarah, I hope you understand the seriousness of this situation. Your job could be on the line here." It did, but looking at Max and Bella, she knew she couldn't abandon them now. They needed her, and somehow she realized she needed them too. With renewed determination, Sarah decided to tackle one problem at a time. First, the dogs needed proper food. She quickly searched online for the best food for malnourished dogs and placed an order for express delivery. Next, she called the local vet, explaining the situation and asking for advice. The vet, concerned about the dog's condition, agreed to do a house call later that afternoon. As Sarah hung up the phone, she heard a commotion in the hallway. Her heart sank as she recognized the voice of Mrs. Peterson, the nosy neighbor from across the hall, demanding to know why Sarah was in Mr. Johnson's apartment. Sarah realized she now had to face her neighbors and explain a situation she barely understood herself. Sarah opened the door to face Mrs. Peterson, a stern-faced woman in her 70s, known for her sharp tongue and penchant for gossip. The older woman's eyes widened as she took in Sarah's disheveled appearance and the state of Mr. Johnson's apartment behind her. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to formulate a response that wouldn't cause more problems. "Mrs. Peterson, I found the dogs abandoned and in terrible condition. I'm just trying to help them." Panic surged through Sarah. The last thing she needed was legal trouble on top of everything else. "Please, Mrs. Peterson," she pleaded, "I'm doing what anyone would do. These dogs were starving and alone. Can't you hear how quiet they are now? They're not barking because they're finally being cared for." The mention of the quietness gave Mrs. Peterson pause. It was true, the constant barking that had plagued the building for months had ceased. Her expression softened slightly, but she still looked skeptical. Sarah saw an opportunity to turn the situation around. "Mrs. Peterson, I could really use your help. Do you know how long Mr. Johnson has been gone, or if he has any family we could contact?" As Mrs. Peterson began sharing what she knew about Mr. Johnson, Sarah felt a small sense of relief. At least now, she had an ally in the building. However, this new information brought its own set of challenges. According to Mrs. Peterson, Mr. Johnson had no close family, and he had mentioned going on a long trip the last time she saw him. This raised more questions. Was he coming back? What would happen to Max and Bella if he didn't? As they talked, Sarah's phone buzzed again. It was a message from her best friend, Lisa, asking why she had missed their planned dinner the night before. Sarah realized with a start that in her exhaustion and stress, she'd completely forgotten about it. She felt a pang of guilt as she saw the series of concerned messages Lisa had sent. Sarah looked around at the apartment, at the dogs slowly regaining their strength, at Mrs. Peterson now fully invested in helping, and at her phone with unanswered messages and missed calls. She realized that in trying to solve one problem, she had inadvertently created a web of new challenges that she would have to navigate carefully. With Mrs. Peterson now on her side, Sarah felt a small boost of confidence. She decided to take action on multiple fronts, addressing the most pressing issues first. The older woman nodded, settling into an armchair and beckoning the dogs over. "Of course, dear. I'll keep an eye on these poor things, don't you worry." "Lisa, I'm so sorry about last night," Sarah began, her voice filled with genuine remorse. "Something crazy has happened, and Sarah paused in the middle of the pet store aisle, the weight of her recent behavior hitting her. She had been so consumed by her sleep deprivation and work stress that she had been pushing away the people closest to her. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Then Lisa sighed, her voice softening. "All right, spill it. What's going on?" As she hung up, Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had been trying to handle everything on her own for so long, it felt good to finally let someone in. "You did the right thing calling me," Dr. Chen said, kneeling to examine Max and Bella. "These dogs are in rough shape, but it's not too late to help them." Sarah's stomach dropped. The reality of potentially losing her job hit her hard. She had worked tirelessly for years to reach her position, and now it was all hanging by a thread. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was she making the right choice? But as she watched Dr. Chen gently treating the dogs, saw the trust in their eyes as they allowed the examination, Sarah felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from her life for a long time. This was bigger than her job, bigger than her sleep problems. This was about doing what was right. As Lisa entered the apartment and took in the scene, the vet treating the dogs, Mrs. Peterson hovering nearby, and the clear signs of neglect around the apartment, her expression softened. "Oh, Sarah," she said quietly, "you really have gotten yourself into something, haven't you?" Lisa put an arm around her friend's shoulders. "Well, that's why you have me. We'll figure this out together." The next morning dawned with a sense of foreboding. Sarah had spent the night on Mr. Johnson's couch, unwilling to leave Max and Bella alone. She woke to the gentle nudge of Bella's nose against her hand, a stark contrast to the jarring alarm that usually started her day. As she prepared for her crucial meeting, Sarah's mind raced. Dr. Chen had left a detailed care plan for the dogs, but their future remained uncertain. The vet had suggested reporting the situation to animal control, but Sarah hesitated, fearing the dogs might end up in a shelter or worse. Lisa arrived early, armed with coffee and a determined look. "Okay, game plan," she said, handing Sarah a much-needed cappuccino. "You go to your meeting. I'll stay here with the dogs." Mrs. Peterson said she'd check in too. With a last look at Max and Bella, who were looking healthier already, Sarah headed to her office. The familiar skyscrapers of Manhattan loomed overhead, but for once, Sarah barely noticed them. Her mind was back in Brooklyn, with two dogs who had unexpectedly become the center of her world. As she entered the sleek modern offices of her marketing firm, Sarah felt like an imposter. Colleagues shot her curious glances as she made her way to the conference room. Her boss, Mr. Hendricks, was already there, his face unreadable. Taking a deep breath, Sarah launched into her explanation. She told him about the abandoned dogs, the neglect they had suffered, and her decision to help them. As she spoke, she realized how absurd it all sounded, risking her career for two dogs she barely knew. "Sarah," he began, his voice cold, "I've always valued your work ethic and creativity, but this is unacceptable. You missed a crucial client meeting, you've been underperforming for months, and now you expect me to believe this story about abandoned dogs." "Enough," he interrupted. "I'm afraid we have to let you go, Sarah. Your recent behavior has cost this company a valuable client. I'm sorry, but I can't overlook that." Sarah's world seemed to tilt on its axis. Fired from her job, and now a crisis with the dogs, it was all spiraling out of control. She stood abruptly, barely registering Mr. Hendricks's surprised expression. Without waiting for a response, Sarah bolted from the office. She raced through the streets of New York, her mind a whirlwind of panic and determination. The subway ride back to Brooklyn felt interminable, each stop an agony of impatience. As she burst into Mr. Johnson's apartment, she was met with a scene of chaos. 2 animal control officers were in the living room, speaking with a visibly distressed Lisa. Mrs. Peterson stood in the corner, wringing her hands anxiously. Max and Bella were huddled together, sensing the tension in the room. One of the officers turned to her. "Ma'am, we received a report of abandoned animals at this address. We're here to take them into protective custody." Sarah hesitated, caught in a moment of truth. She wasn't the owner, but in that moment she realized she wanted to be. These dogs, who had once been the source of her misery, had become incredibly important to her. The second officer, who had been examining the dogs, spoke up. "She's right, John. These dogs look well cared for now. They're not in immediate danger." "Look," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I know this situation isn't ideal, but I promise you, these dogs are loved and cared for now. Give me a chance to make this right. Let me adopt them officially." Finally, the first officer spoke. "All right, here's what we're going to do." The sudden appearance of the long-absent owner sent shockwaves through the gathered group. Sarah felt her heart sink. Just when she thought she had found a solution, Mr. Johnson's return threatened to upend everything. Mr. Johnson's face crumpled, a mix of shame and anguish washing over his features. I didn't abandon them," he said, his voice breaking. "I was in the hospital. I had a stroke. I've been trying to get back to them for weeks." Mr. Johnson stumbled forward, dropping to his knees beside Max and Bella. The dogs, recognizing their owner despite his altered appearance, wagged their tails hesitantly. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, tears streaming down his face as he hugged them. "I never meant to leave you alone." The first animal control officer cleared his throat. "Sir, while we understand your situation, we still have concerns about the dog's care. You were unable to make arrangements for them during your absence." As the tension in the room reached a fever pitch, Sarah found herself at a crossroads. She looked at Mr. Johnson, broken and pleading, then at Max and Bella, caught in the middle of this emotional storm. In that moment, she made a decision that would change all their lives. All eyes turned to her as she took a deep breath and continued, "Mr. Johnson, it's clear you love Max and Bella, but you're not in a position to care for them full-time right now. And I've grown to love them too." Her voice wavered slightly, but she pressed on. "What if we shared custody?" Sarah nodded, warming to the idea as she spoke. "Yes, you're clearly not fully recovered, and you'll need time to get back on your feet. I can keep the dogs with me, care for them day to day, and you can visit as often as you like. As you recover, we can adjust the arrangement." The animal control officers exchanged glances. Then the senior officer spoke up. "That could work. It would ensure the dogs are cared for while allowing the owner to maintain his rights. We'd need to formalize the agreement, of course." Sarah smiled, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. "The dogs brought us together for a reason. Maybe this is it." Lisa squeezed her arm supportively. "Only you could turn a noise complaint into a co-parenting situation," she whispered, a hint of admiration in her voice. In the days that followed, Sarah, Mr. Johnson, and the dogs settled into their new arrangement. The animal control officers, satisfied with the solution, helped formalize the shared custody agreement. Sarah found herself navigating a new normal, balancing her unexpected role as a dog co-parent with the sudden upheaval in her professional life. Mr. Johnson, still weak from his stroke but improving daily, became a regular visitor to Sarah's apartment. Their initial awkwardness soon gave way to a warm camaraderie, bonded by their shared love for Max and Bella. Sarah learned that Mr. Johnson was a retired veteran who lived alone, and the dogs had been his sole companions for years. His gratitude for Sarah's intervention was palpable, and he often expressed how her kindness had given him a new lease on life. As for Max and Bella, they thrived under the new arrangement. With consistent care, good nutrition, and plenty of love, their health improved dramatically. The once constant barking that had driven Sarah to despair became a thing of the past. Instead, the dogs greeted her each morning with wagging tails and happy whines, their presence a soothing balm to the stress of her job loss. Sarah's apartment, once a lonely space that echoed with the noise from next door, became a warm, lively home. The patter of paws on hardwood floors, the jingle of collar tags, and the soft snoring of contented dogs became the new soundtrack of her life. She found herself looking forward to each day, despite the uncertainty of her professional future. As weeks passed, Sarah's life took on a new rhythm. Her mornings, once rushed and stress-filled, now started with leisurely walks in the park with Max and Bella. She found herself chatting with other dog owners, forming new connections in her community. The dog's playful antics and unconditional affection provided a constant source of joy and laughter, helping to ease the sting of her recent job loss. Mr. Johnson's health continued to improve, and he became an integral part of their unconventional family unit. He shared stories of his time in the service and taught Sarah tricks for managing the dog's behavior. In return, Sarah helped him navigate technology to stay connected with his doctors and even set up video calls with old military buddies. The shared responsibility for the dogs created an unexpected support system. When Sarah had job interviews, Mr. Johnson would watch the dogs. When he had physical therapy appointments, Sarah would ensure he got there safely. Their teamwork extended beyond just caring for Max and Bella. They were caring for each other too. One afternoon, as they sat in the park watching the dogs play, Mr. Johnson turned to Sarah with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, his voice gruff with emotion, "I've been thinking about what you did for Max and Bella for me. Not many people would have done that." Mr. Johnson nodded, then added, "I've got a friend who runs a non-profit for veterans. They're looking for someone with marketing experience to help spread the word about their programs. I told him about you. He'd like to meet, if you're interested." The offer from Mr. Johnson's friend marked a turning point for Sarah. As she prepared for the interview with the veterans non-profit, she realized how much her perspective had shifted in the weeks since she'd first encountered Max and Bella. Sitting on her couch with the dogs curled up beside her, Sarah reflected on the whirlwind of changes. She remembered the exhausted, frustrated woman she'd been, so focused on her career that she'd lost sight of what truly mattered. The Sarah of a few months ago would have scoffed at the idea of co-parenting dogs with her neighbor or considering a job at a non-profit. But as she scratched behind Max's ears and felt Bella's warm weight against her leg, Sarah knew she wouldn't trade this new life for anything. The corporate world had never given her the sense of fulfillment she now felt every day, seeing the positive impact she could make in the lives of others, both human and canine. Her friendship with Mr. Johnson had opened her eyes to the struggles veterans face, igniting a passion to help that she never knew she had. The thought of using her marketing skills to make a real difference in people's lives filled her with excitement and purpose. As if sensing her contemplative mood, Max lifted his head and gave her hand a gentle lick. Sarah smiled, feeling a wave of affection wash over her. These dogs, once the source of her greatest frustration, had become the catalyst for profound change in her life. They had taught her patience, compassion, and the joy of unconditional love. The day of Sarah's interview arrived, bringing with it a mix of nervousness and excitement. As she prepared to leave, she found Mr. Johnson at her door, ready to dog-sit. The genuine smile on his face and the encouraging words he offered reminded Sarah of how far they'd come from being strangers, separated by a wall of barking. You've got this, Sarah," Mr. Johnson said, his eyes twinkling. "Just show them the same heart you showed these two rascals," he added, gesturing to Max and Bella, who were wagging their tails excitedly. As she walked to the interview, Sarah's mind wandered to the incredible journey of the past few months. She thought about the night she had contemplated the unthinkable act of harming the dogs, and how that moment of desperation had led to this new chapter in her life. The guilt she had carried about those dark thoughts had transformed into a fierce determination to advocate for animals and those who couldn't speak for themselves. Entering the non-profit's office, Sarah felt a sense of coming home. The walls were adorned with photos of veterans and their service dogs, stories of lives changed and hope restored. As she began her interview, sharing her experiences and the passion she had discovered, Sarah knew she had found her calling. The interviewers were visibly impressed by her enthusiasm and the unique perspective she brought. When they offered her the job on the spot, Sarah felt tears of joy welling up in her eyes. She had lost a job, but gained a purpose, and it all started with 2 barking dogs and a noise complaint. As Sarah settled into her new role at the Veterans Non-Profit, her life took on a beautiful balance she had never experienced before. Her days were filled with meaningful work, using her marketing skills to share stories of hope and resilience, connecting veterans with the support they needed, and even developing programs that paired rescue dogs with veterans in need of companionship. Evenings and weekends were spent with Max and Bella, often joined by Mr. Johnson. The trio would explore local parks, attend community events, and even volunteer at animal shelters together. Sarah's apartment, once a source of stress and isolation, had become the heart of a unique and loving family unit. The dogs, now healthy and happy, were a constant reminder of the power of compassion and second chances. Their transformation mirrored Sarah's own journey from a stressed, career-focused individual to someone who had found true fulfillment in helping others and nurturing connections. As Sarah reflected on the twists and turns that had brought her to this point, she realized that what had once seemed like the lowest point in her life, the sleepless nights, the job loss, the moment of desperation, had actually been the beginning of her most rewarding adventure. The constant barking that had once driven her to the brink had become a distant memory, replaced by the joyful sounds of wagging tails, friendly chatter and laughter. Sarah had not only found peace, but had created a ripple of positive change that extended far beyond her own life. In the months that followed, Sarah's life continued to flourish in ways she never imagined. Her work at the Veterans Non-Profit gained recognition, and she spearheaded a successful campaign that significantly increased funding for veteran support programs. The initiative she developed, pairing rescue dogs with veterans, became a model program, attracting national attention and spreading to other cities. Mr. Johnson, fully recovered, became an active volunteer at the non-profit, sharing his experiences and mentoring younger veterans. His friendship with Sarah deepened, and he became like family to her. Together, they created a support network for other pet owners in their building, ensuring no animal would ever be left in the situation Max and Bella had faced. Max and Bella, once the source of neighborhood complaints, became local celebrities. Their story of rescue and redemption inspired many in the community to adopt shelter animals. The once noisy apartment building transformed into a pet-friendly haven, with residents coming together for regular pet playgroups and community events. Sarah's journey from corporate executive to passionate advocate for animals and veterans became a testament to the unexpected ways life can lead us to our true calling. 5 years later, Sarah stood at the podium of a national conference on animal welfare and veteran support. As she shared her story, she caught sight of Mr. Johnson in the audience, proudly holding Max and Bella's leashes. The dogs, now therapy animals, wagged their tails contentedly. Sarah smiled, realizing that sometimes the most beautiful symphonies of life begin with a disruptive bark. As you reflect on Sarah's journey, consider the unexpected ways compassion can transform lives. Whether it's helping a neighbor, volunteering at a local shelter, or supporting veterans in your community, small acts of kindness can create ripples of positive change. Remember, every bark of frustration might be an opportunity for growth and connection in disguise. What will your next act of kindness be?